Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, that's pretty good. I'm Becky Hogue, and I welcome you to this program today. And I have to look, this is our 35th season, and we've been here at the library since it was built. And before that, we were just next door, basically, at First Methodist Church. So we skipped a couple years because of COVID, so now, or it would be our 37th season. My parents started this program, and I see many of you out there that knew my parents, and they got all kinds of interesting people. And back in 2018, we decided, was when Laura was last here and did the book Profiles in Courage. And one of the big things my father liked is to get new people in this community to come do a program, and Laura was fairly new in her position at the city as the city administrator, and so we are really glad to have her back. And I'll let a couple people get in the door there. I wanted to just let you know that I have a clipboard at the back, the green clipboard on the back table, and if you'd like to be on my monthly email list, please sign up, and you'll just get one email a month from me telling what's coming up, and then in August I'll let you know what's coming up for the new season, hopefully. So, hello. Anyway, Laura's all set. She's a pro here, so I'm just going to go ahead and let Laura have the microphone. Laura Newman, thank you.
Becky, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to see so many people here today to hear this presentation. I hope it's because, many of you have an interest in Madeleine Albright, as I do, but I also see a lot of my friends' faces out here, and I know that you are also here for morale support, so thank you. I greatly appreciate that, too. Let me put my glasses on. I can actually read my notes. So I love the opportunity today to share with you a person who I think is one of our greatest American citizens and somebody who has always been a role model to me, Madeleine Albright. She wrote 2 memoirs, and I've got them here. The first she wrote a couple of years after she left her position as Secretary of State in 2003. And then the second one, Hell and Other Destinations, she wrote in 2020, and looking back both in the years where she served and then also talking about things that she had done since that time. And so I'll be touching on information from both of those in my presentation. We'll start at the beginning. Madeleine Albright was born Marie Jana Korbel on May 15, 1937, in Simkov district of Prague, Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was something special at the time that she was born. It was the only democracy in Eastern Europe between World War I and World War II. The first time that the family had to flee Czechoslovakia as refugees was during World War II. When the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia, they deposed the elected leaders, and they installed a puppet regime. Her parents feared that they would end up on the Gestapo's list of people who should be arrested, and so Madeleine was sent to live with her grandmother in the countryside. But one day, in 1939, her grandmother brought her back to Prague, and that night, by 11 p.m., she and her parents boarded a train to London with only 2 suitcases in their hands. And it was the last time that her parents saw their parents alive. It would be 6 years before they could return to Czechoslovakia. After the war ended in Europe, the family returned to Prague. Madeleine was 8 years old. During the time that her family was in London, her father, they were living amongst other Czechoslovakians in asylum, and he performed a radio program to broadcast to fellow Czechs in asylum elsewhere, and then also just to publicize the facts of the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. When they returned to Prague, a communist party was growing inside Czechoslovakia, and by 1946, it had become the largest political party. The picture here is of the Korbel family. I believe that Madeline is the cherubic little face down there on the lower left-hand side. I'm sorry, right-hand side. There was a coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948, and it ended her parents' hope for a free Czechoslovakia. Her father had been a close political ally of the democratically elected president who was assassinated. And so he knew he had to get the family out of Czechoslovakia quickly. He got a job with the United Nations and moved the family again to London. However, they weren't there for long. They boarded a ship and came to New York City to seek political asylum here in the United States. It wasn't so easy because her father had worked for the Czech government when it was under communist rule. He had to convince US authorities that he continued to work toward restoring a democracy and would likely be arrested if he was to be returned to Czechoslovakia. It actually took 5 years for the Korbel family to achieve citizenship. And this was, 1950, and it was McCarthyism, and so certainly that made things much harder and heightened the scrutiny that they were under. They were not in New York for very long before the family moved to Denver, Colorado. It was for her father to take a job at a university as a professor of international studies. One of his future students would be none other than Condoleezza Rice, future Secretary of State, who considered him one of her greatest mentors. Madeline admits to not being a very popular student. And this she blames on the fact that she says she was a very serious student. She also said that having very strict parents who insisted upon testing her suitors did not help her social life very much. However, perhaps foreshadowing her future, in 10th grade, she started an international relationships club, and that's what you see pictured here. Off to Wellesley. After high school, she went to Wellesley, and in her book, she writes of these times, "It's all for the best in the best of all possible worlds." It's a line from the 1956 Leonard Bernstein musical, Candide. It captured my excitement about my college years. It was a time when women in college were preparing for careers in male-dominated positions. Others were there for their MRS. It never occurred to me that I couldn't do both. And so it was here that she met her best friends and had very successful academic and social life. And these friends she would stay close to all of her life. Wellesley was a great place for a young woman at this time with an aspiration to succeed in a career that was dominated by men. Being all female, girls held all the leadership positions. They were student council presidents. They were team captains and valedictorians. To quote Madeline, "No one had to pretend to be dumb in class not to show up the boys." The women professors were role models and mentors. While still attending Wellesley, she met her husband, Joe Albright, and it was while they were interning at the Denver Post. Funny story here, when she heard that Joe was from Chicago, she said, "It's funny, I dated a boy from Chicago once. His name was," I forget what the name was, but Joe said, "That's my best friend." Isn't that ironic? Wow. But Madeline soon discovered that Joe came from a very influential family. Joe's great-grandfather was Joseph Medill, who started the Chicago Tribune. His grandfather, Joseph Medill Patterson, founded the New York Daily Post. And his great-aunt, Sissy Patterson, owned the Washington Times-Herald, which was later sold to Katharine Graham's father, Eugene Meyer, and became the Washington Post. Joe's father, Ivan Albright, is a famous American painter, probably best known for one of his paintings called Picture of Dorian Gray. The two were married in 1959. Of her marriage to Joe Albright, Madeline says, 12 years after coming to the United States as a refugee, I was an American citizen. I'd acquired a precious circle of friends. I had graduated with honors from a top-notch college that specialized in equipping women with leadership skills. I'd married an American prince whom I adored and who loved me. I had tried on the glass slipper and it fit. In the fairy tale, this is where the story ends. In life, it's merely the beginning of a new chapter. So the story told in this book of what her early efforts to get a job looked like, here it is. Joe got a job with the newspaper, the Chicago Sun-Times, in fact. And when Madeline met her husband's boss, she told him that she would like to get a job in journalism as well. And he said, the newspaper has a rule against husbands and wives working at the same newspaper, and it really wouldn't be very good for Joe's career if you were to work at a competing newspaper, so you should probably look at doing something else. Another thing is, anytime she went on a job interview, she was always asked about her plans, future family plans, and if she planned to get pregnant. But she did eventually land her first job with Rand McNally as a photo editor, until you see who she's holding in her arms. Twin daughters, Anne and Alice, were born premature and had to spend an additional 6 weeks in the hospital. And so what did Madeline do? She enrolled in a class and took a course to learn to speak Russian. But her efforts to launch a career were frustrating. Here's something that she found in an old journal that she had written. Twice in 2 years, I have had to leave good jobs with good futures to follow my husband's path. And that was even before I had children. Now, even to get a job, I would have to find a dependable nurse and pay her perhaps more than I could make myself. Perhaps I'm being overly pessimistic. Perhaps I could go out tomorrow and get a job as a typist. The next question is, why bother? Do I want to have a job merely to have a job? Or do I want to work in order to do something worthwhile? I must admit, though, that I feel somewhat like a pioneer. I am not satisfied to sit back the rest of my life and contemplate in which order to clean these rooms. I want to find a solution and still feel that somehow it must be possible to be a responsible mother, a good wife, and have an intellectually satisfying job. In 1968, Joe's job at Newsweek took them to Washington, D.C. In 1975, she received her PhD from Columbia University's Russian Institute. Her dissertation was about the journalist's role in the Prague Spring of 1968. This name is hard to pronounce, but it is one of her greatest mentors, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski would later become Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and was a faculty member at Columbia University during the time that she was there. Through her volunteer work that she was doing in Washington, D.C., she had opportunity to meet Senator Edwin Muskie, and she ended up working on his 1972 presidential campaign. Although he didn't win, a greatly valued, decades-long friendship began. And here she is with Edwin Muskie and President Carter. In 1976, at the age of 39, Edwin Muskie hired her to be his chief legislative assistant, and she served as his foreign policy advisor. This was a groundbreaking moment in her career. She worked closely with Muskie on international relations and foreign policy matters, focusing on issues like the Vietnam War and arms control. Her time with Muskie provided valuable experience that she would use later in her career. Okay, now, fasten your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen. This lady's career is about to take off. Her time on Senator Muskie's staff turned out to be pretty short. Just 2 years later, in 1978, her old professor, I get to say it again, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Gesundheit, calls and asks if she would like to work in the Carter administration at the White House. The job was to handle the congressional relations for the National Security Council. Very big job. The job, what she did was to represent their foreign policy priorities. She coordinated legislative strategy, sat in on presidential meetings with members of Congress, and responded to questions from the Hill. Little funny side story. The first meeting where she was in the Oval Office, she was trying to take notes, but she was so intimidated by the setting that she was having a hard time writing things down. Toward the end of the meeting, Brzezinski asks her, "Madeline, can you read back what the president, the words of the policy that he wanted?" And she had to admit that she hadn't written it down. And when later he confronted her about it, she said, "Well, I don't see why, if I'm the only female in the room, I'm expected to be the note taker." He said, "Madeline, it isn't because you're female, it's because you're the most junior person in the room you have to take notes." So after that point, she understood. But the Carter administration, it was rough times. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, rising oil prices were wrecking our economy, 53 Americans were taken hostage, and there was a failed rescue mission. As a result, Carter would be beat soundly by Ronald Reagan in 1980, and Madeline was again looking for a job. Times were about to get even more troubling for Madeline. She was very surprised when her husband, Joe Albright, announced that he was leaving her for someone else. After the breakup, she decided to become a professor at Georgetown University, where in addition to teaching, she created the Donner Women's Program. And the purpose of the Donner Program was to encourage women to pursue careers in international relations, and she served as a role model for these young women. She spoke with passion about how women must make sure not to push the ladder away from the building after they have climbed to the top, but must help each other succeed. It was something of a theme for her throughout her life. Her next adventure would be to be foreign policy advisor for several political candidates, including vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro for Walter Mondale's running mate in 1984. And also in 1988, she advised the Dukakis campaign. There was a very important event that happened in 1989 that marked a very important moment in Czechoslovakian history, as well as, and also for Madeleine Albright. Václav Havel, a dissident playwright, is about to become one of the world's most respected figures in the Velvet Revolution, so called because it was achieved in such a peaceful manner. It began as a student uprising, and when the students began uprising, they were brutally beaten by police, and this rallied their parents to come to their aid. And in fact, the whole center of Prague filled with 300,000 people, while the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra played for them all. It was by the end of the year, Václav Havel would be elected president, and communism was dead in Czechoslovakia after 4 decades. In 1993, Bill Clinton nominated Madeleine Albright to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the first woman ever to hold this post. There are 15 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and during her tenure, the other 14 members were men. So she joked that if she wrote her memoir at that point, she thought a good title would be 14 Suits and a Skirt. Here's a quote from her book, and it talks about 4 important world events that happened during this time and her impressions of them. Sitting at my desk in New York or at the State Department, I read each morning of new clashes, murders, outrages, and threats. I did so knowing that people everywhere looked to the United States and the Security Council to find solutions. We had no chance to catch our breath. Everything was urgent. And so we made our decisions based upon the best information available each day, inevitably influenced by the effect of our decisions reached the previous day, week, or year. We felt our way step by step, sometimes stepping wrong and having to retrace. In Somalia, we tried to do too much. In Rwanda, we did too little. In Haiti and Bosnia, after false starts, we finally got it right. And so I'll talk about each of those situations a little bit more deeply. In Somalia, U.S. led a UN mission to provide humanitarian aid for widespread starvation in that country as a result of years-long civil war. There were 28,000 troops who were sent in, but they were met with very strong anti-US and anti-UN sentiment. After gunmen ambushed UN peacekeepers, a US quick reaction force was sent in. What happened next is the subject of a famous film called Black Hawk Down. Some of the soldiers were eventually rescued, but others were taken hostage or died, their bodies dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. She admits that mistakes were made in not providing the means to accomplish the goals that had been set, and as a result, some brave Americans died. The disunity of the UN relations between the US and the other members contributed to that failure, and thereafter the UN worked on beefing up its peacekeeping capabilities. However, the deepest regret of her time in public service was Rwanda, and the failure of the United States and the international community to act sooner to halt the crimes that were being committed. There had been warnings that Hutu militants were planning a massive operation against their Tutsi countrymen. The shooting down of the Tutsi president's airplane signaled the beginning of the Hutus' operation. There was insufficient information about the scale of the killing that was being carried out. The UN was still reeling from the peacekeeping mission failures in Somalia at the same time, and action was taken too late. The estimated death toll in Rwanda was 800,000 men, women, and children. The lessons learned in Somalia did not apply to Rwanda. Somalia was something like chaos. Rwanda was a planned mass murder. In the end, she says, they should have listened to the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, who were there on the ground and were trying to alert them that this was happening. And she ends with these two segments with this quote: "With the possible exception of Rome, no society has ever auditioned for the role of world policeman. Certainly, the United States, at least through the end of the 20th century, never desired that part. As for the UN, it has shown the ability to play the world night watchman. It can monitor and it can raise the alarm, but cannot guarantee that the alarm, once sounded, will be answered." And then there was Haiti. Since the 1960s, this impoverished country suffered under the brutal regime of Papa Doc Duvalier first, and then thereafter his son Jean-Claude, who was called Baby Doc. In 1993, the United States sent a ship with Army engineers and trainers to try to help restore a democratically elected president in Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide. The ship was turned away and Aristide was overthrown by the country's military. Economic sanctions resulted in the UN having to feed over 1 million people per day in Haiti. Meanwhile, the military regime was carrying out executions to those loyal to Aristide. The regime kicked out UN human rights monitors. A UN coalition agreed to a peacekeeping mission, and this was enough to threaten the military regime. They gave up, and Aristide was restored as the country's president. The lessons learned in Somalia, Rwanda, and Haiti is that a cookie-cutter approach would not work. Each situation is unique and demands a unique solution. The international community, through the UN or other means, had a clear responsibility to help societies who are endangered by human-caused or natural catastrophe. It was in America's best interest to ensure that this responsibility was fulfilled because it would make the world more stable and peaceful, and because it was right. She traveled the whole world during her tenure. She said, "Seeing the misery of these conditions made me think of politicians back home who belittled public service and ran down our government institutions. I thought to myself, let them come here to the cracked edges of the world and experience life without big government." After all, there was no federal income tax in Liberia, no ban on assault weapons in Angola, no bleeding heart judges in Rwanda, no welfare system in Sudan, and no burdensome environmental controls in the Caucasus. Lastly, when I talk about her role in the United Nations, one of the biggest things that she did was she played a very pivotal role in the Kosovo conflict during the 1990s. She was a staunch advocate for NATO intervention to stop the ethnic cleansing and violence perpetrated by Serbian forces under Slobodan Milosevic. And this was perpetrated against the ethnic Albanians there. Albright strongly supported diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis, but she also pushed for military action when diplomatic measures failed. She played a key role in advocating for NATO's Operation Allied Force, which involved in a sustained bombing campaign against Serbian targets in Kosovo and Serbia itself, aiming to halt the violence and to force Milosevic's regime to withdraw its forces from Kosovo. Her diplomacy and leadership were instrumental in rallying international support for NATO's intervention in Kosovo, ultimately leading to the end of the conflict with the signing of the Dayton Accords in 1995 and the establishment of a UN administration in Kosovo. On December 5th, 1996, after being elected to a second term, Bill Clinton nominated Madeleine Albright to be Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton strongly influenced this choice, telling her husband, "Only if you pick Madeleine will you get a person who shares your values, who is an eloquent defender of your foreign policy, and who will make every girl proud." On January 22nd, the full Senate voted 99-0 to confirm her. After 207 years, a woman would run the Department of State. Her worst day in office as Secretary of State was when our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed on August 7th, 1998. More than 220 people died and more than 5,000 people were injured. Getting ahead of myself. An embassy employee in Africa had written to her months before to warn that the embassies on the continent needed tighter security. She says that letter never reached her desk, but she accepted responsibility for not having taken action on that. The bombing was attributed to Al-Qaeda and to Osama bin Laden, who stated after the Gulf War that he had vowed to kill Americans wherever they were. In retaliation, we bombed his strongholds in Afghanistan and Sudan in retaliation. Madeleine Albright visited, and she flew home with the bodies of those who had been killed. And here's what she says about that. "They were the faces of America, the kind of unpretentious but remarkable people who represent our country overseas, doing their jobs, solving problems, winning friends for democracy. I thought with some bitterness about the persistent stereotypes of embassy life, in which diplomats supposedly go about in striped pants, giving parties, and living in splendor. The reality is much more mundane. The evil at other points in my life, Hitler, Stalin, racism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. But now our country has been drawn into a conflict against an enemy that was not clearly visible, on a battlefield that is undefined and in which we would all be on the front lines. I experienced at that moment a most crushing sense of responsibility. Like most people in public life, I'd often ask how government officials should be held accountable. And it's easy enough when you're pointing the finger at someone else. I felt now as if all eyes were on me. I knew I could not guarantee the safety of our people, but I had a responsibility to do everything within my power to try. This was no longer a matter of simply doing my job, but one of loyalty, honor, and trust. During her tenure, Boris Yeltsin resigned, making way for a new Russian president. Perhaps you've heard of him, Vladimir Putin. Following the Iron Curtain being lifted, a coterie of corrupt officials literally drained the country of most of its assets, causing their economy to shrink by 55%. By contrast, the American economy only shrunk by 1/3 during the Great Depression. The Putin government mostly refused any interaction with the US Department of State. The Russians wanted a leader with a strong hand who could restore order, and they had that in Putin. The question became whether his style of order would allow Russia to function as a successful democracy. Well, unfortunately, I think we're well aware of the answer to that question today. Back when she became UN ambassador, Madeline would receive letters from people who would tell her that she had Jewish heritage and that members of her family, some of them had died in the Holocaust. But it wasn't until 1997 that she really came to terms with that discovery. Her parents had never revealed that they were Jewish. She had been raised Roman Catholic. So she had contacted her siblings and had made plans to go back to Czechoslovakia to research this. But before she even had an opportunity to do that, there was a huge Washington Post article. A reporter had gotten wind of this news and documented that her paternal parents and maternal grandmothers had died at Auschwitz. He showed her a photograph with all of her family in it, and it included Madeline and an older cousin who was also taken to Auschwitz. In all, more than a dozen of her family members died in Nazi death camps. Some out there, cruelly I think, could not believe that she didn't know about her Jewish heritage and that she just lied about it, or that her father purposely kept his Jewish heritage hidden in order to improve his career. Later in 1997, she traveled to Czechoslovakia, to Prague, to the Pinkas Synagogue. There on the walls are written all of the Czechoslovakian Jews who perished in the Holocaust. She was not prepared for what seeing her grandparents' names on that wall would make her feel. Whatever my expectations, this is her quote, I had not foreseen that I would start visualizing my grandparents in striped concentration camp uniforms, seeing their hollow faces staring back at me. I realized as I did that I had no clear idea of what my grandparents had looked like during the war because I had only seen pictures of them from years before. I thought about how they must have suffered, their struggle to survive, the torture of their last hours. I thought also of the anguish experienced by my parents that had been so well hidden from me, the pain of leave-taking, the agony of not knowing, the sorrow of learning, and the determination to protect. As I turned away from the names on the walls, I felt both profoundly sorrowful and grateful. My family's presence on those walls had added a direct personal element, but not fundamentally changed my view of the Holocaust or its horrors. However, I now knew that if not for my parents' decision to leave Prague, their names and mine would also be on the synagogue wall, and my sister and brother would not have existed. My parents had given me life not once, but twice. Madeleine Albright, later in her life, would go on to author a whole book about her Jewish family that was called Prague Winter. This first memoir ends thusly. People sometimes ask me how I want to be remembered. I replied, I don't want to be remembered. I'm still here. But when the day comes, I hope people will say that I did the best with what I was given, tried to make my parents proud, served my country with all the energy I had, and took a strong stand on the side of freedom. Perhaps some will say, I helped teach a generation of older women to stand tall, and young women not to be afraid to interrupt. Before I transition to the next book, there's a couple of slides. You can't talk about Madeline without talking about the pins. In the book, she said Warren Christopher, her predecessor, had these flashy ties that he would wear, and so for her, it was her pins. When she was in the UN, and she was in Iraq, and she was talking to a high-level official, the news media had come out with a story, and they had like some poem in it, and comparing her to all sorts of awful things, and one of them being a snake. So she realized on that trip she brought her snake pin with her, so she decided to pop it on her jacket the next day, and that's like all the media focused on was that snake pin on her jacket. So from that day forward, she decided that the pin was going to relate to what she was doing that day. And some examples that she has is she's got a pin that has all of the insignias of the 5 branches of the military, and if ever she was at a military event, then she would wear that pin. She also had one that was a spider for on those rare occasions when I was feeling devious, a balloon when I was up, the Capitol building to show bipartisanship, and a bee when I was looking for someone to sting. Then she said when she was meeting with the Russian foreign minister on the subject of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, she wore a pin that was shaped like a little missile. And the Russian asked, is that one of your interceptor missiles? And I said, yes, as you can see, we know how to make them quite small, so you better be ready to negotiate. After that, before long, she was telling reporters looking for news items to read my pins. And she would later author a coffee table book of the same name. She had a few appearances on the small screen, too. That top picture is from Gilmore Girls. The bottom left is a show based on the title of her book, called Madam Secretary, and the one on the bottom right is Parks and Rec. In season 7 episode of Parks and Rec, Albright advises National Park Service Regional Director Leslie Knope on how to deal with a dispute with one of her employees. At the end, she says, can I have my pin back now? And Amy Poehler was wearing her silver and gold dove brooch. In Gilmore Girls, Albright appears in a dream sequence in which she snuggles up with Rory and to wish her a happy birthday, repeating lines that Rory's mother Lorelei had delivered in season 1. And when she wakes up, she says to her boyfriend, I just had a dream that Madeleine Albright was my mother. On Madam Secretary, which took its title from Albright's 2003 memoir, Albright actually appeared twice to provide guidance to the fictional Elizabeth McCord. And she says, one of her other famous lines, there is plenty of room in the world for mediocre men. There is no room for mediocre women. And in the 5th season, she shows up with other secretaries of state, Colin Powell and Hillary Clinton, to warn McCord about the threat of nationalism and the importance of diversity. So on to Hell and Other Destinations, which I found to be quite a great title. This one, again, published in 2020, and it was really a contrast from the first autobiography. Instead of being more of a, the first one, a chronological recitation of her background, her education, and the role she played in all of these significant world events, instead, this one seemed like the stories Madeleine wants to tell you. And it was really, really a fun read. In both of these, I'll say, she's an excellent writer. The way that she conveys these events, you feel you're right there in the middle of them, and you're there with someone who influenced their outcomes. I had a lot of fun reading Hell and Other Destinations, and I want to just share some highlights there. The first was Colin Powell, who she was frenemies with. He once said that when they were going through Kosovo, and she said, you know, diplomacy isn't working and we really need to start using our military. You know, Colin Powell was there and he said, we don't want to get stuck in another quagmire like Vietnam. And he accuses Madeleine Albright of almost giving him an aneurysm. In the end, they did decide on military action and brought about the Dayton Accords, but I think both of them worked very well together to make sure that the timing was right. So, although they had notoriously clashed there, Albright had nothing but the kindest and most respectful things to say about Colin Powell in both of her memoirs. Here is the letter that she left in the desk for Colin Powell because he succeeded her as Secretary of State. Dear Colin, we've been working hard and I hope when you arrive in the office it is clean. It will, however, still be filled with the spirit of our predecessors, all of whom felt representing the United States to be the greatest honor. So I turn over to you the best job in the world. Good luck and best wishes, Madeleine. Another chapter in the book was about her decision to write her memoirs. And I'm contemplating writing down all of her stories. She says, I treasured being Secretary of State, but that doesn't mean I went around whistling all the time. There were many days when I didn't get my way in a meeting, and I left with steam pouring out of my ears, vowing that when I wrote my memoirs, I would get my revenge. Just wait, I thought. I'll lay it all out on the table, and the whole world will see that I was right and they were wrong, and how unfairly I was treated. But then, when I began to write these incidents to paper, I found I'd either forgotten why I'd been so furious or was unable to explain what had happened in a way that proved my point. So one of the great opportunities she had was her favorite book is Love in the Time of Cholera, a book by Gabriela Garcia Marquez, and she had an opportunity to meet with Gabriela and ask him for advice about writing her memoirs, and this is what he said. When you write your memoir, Madeleine, do not be angry. And she isn't throughout the whole thing, even when she might be talking about the most despicable person doing the most despicable thing, and she recites the facts and lets you make the decision all on your own and doesn't influence it. She loved being part of the Washington Speakers Bureau and did hundreds and hundreds of speeches. She said she did these for everything from teachers, accountants, travel agents, pharmacists, factory workers, hospitals, members of the Junior League, and members of the fertilizer industry. She loved to engage in face-to-face communication, whether it's a large theater of people or just in a small group. She hosted dinners at her house with a dozen people just to talk about world events. And one of the things that I admire about her is that she represented a form of discourse in which parties try to understand each other by standing in their shoes, not merely trying to get the other person convinced of your point. It made her an exceptional diplomat and negotiator. The part she always found difficult was leaving her speaking engagements because everyone wanted to talk to her on the way out. So she and her assistant devised these strategies for ways that they could get her back out on the road. And so she said during these times she was giving these speeches, she made more getaways than Bonnie and Clyde. The Albright Group was chartered by Madeleine Albright to assist and encourage U.S. firms to invest in emerging democracies. Her first client was the huge pharmaceutical firm Merck. This is in 2001 when Merck was a leading producer of antiviral treatments for HIV/AIDS. And she assisted them with standing up programs in Botswana, where at the time, the president of Botswana said we face no less than extinction from this disease. From there, her team assisted Merck to do the same in Romania, and then many, many firms followed to seek the assistance of her consulting firm because she was able to operate in all of these foreign countries to try to help them get their industry there, get their investments there, and all the time helping the cause of freedom. Professor Albright, what I wouldn't have given to be in an international relations class with Madeleine Albright. Wow. So she was, of course, in Hell and Other Destinations, she recounts the joy she feels in her classroom. She delights seeing her students role play what they would do in an international crisis. She says, as a professor, my ambition is simple: to bring to the surface the best qualities that already exist in my students. That process, repeated by instructors in classrooms everywhere, many millions of times a day, is infinitely complex and never fully satisfying, but its importance cannot be overstated. British writer H.G. Wells observed a century ago that as the modern era advances, history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe, and that is a race we must win. Reading this book, I hadn't realized that she was very interested in the intersection of religion and foreign policy. While she refers to it casually as her God book, its formal title is The Mighty and the Almighty: Reflections on America, God, and World Affairs. In it, she deeply examines her own beliefs and shares how faith supported her through many difficult times she faced throughout her life and throughout her career. On May 12, 1996, while U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine was interviewed by Leslie Stahl about the effect of the UN sanctions in Iraq. Leslie asked, "We have heard 500,000 children have died as a result of UN sanctions in Iraq. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. Is it worth it?" Madeleine's answer, "I think that is a very hard choice, but the price, we think the price is worth it." She wishes she had instead cut out her tongue. It's the most regrettable words, she said, that she ever spoke. It was later discovered that the statistic was propaganda, and that while perhaps there wasn't a significant increase in child mortality, there certainly was suffering on the part of Iraqi citizens. But no matter, Madeleine's statement had actually changed some hearts and minds, very importantly, that America was the villain in the story. I respect the fact that she went so deeply into this event to not to say, tell my side of the story and feel better about it, but to own the responsibility of it. This is Madeleine Albright's official portrait. It was done shortly after she left office. The artist is Steve Polson, and Secretary Albright thinks he did a right good job of it. Condoleezza Rice hosted the unveiling of this portrait on April 14th, 2008. Given the strong relationship that formed between these two ladies when she was Secretary of State, when Hillary Clinton announced her candidacy in the 2008 election, it was an easy decision for Madeleine to back her. And she takes the opportunity in her book to say that it wasn't because of her friendship that she did this, but because she truly felt that Hillary was the best candidate for the job. Obviously, not everyone agreed. Barack Obama, who had the advantage of being an upstart running on a platform to take on an establishment candidate, ultimately won the nomination, and the rest is history. I will always remember a line from Hillary's concession speech, quoted in this book. "Although we weren't able to shatter the hardest, highest glass ceiling this time, thanks to you, it's got about 18 million cracks in it. And the light is shining through like never before, filling us with all the hope and sure knowledge that the path will be easier next time." And Hillary went on to become Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Established in 1963 by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the The Presidential Medal of Freedom is the nation's highest civilian award. To qualify, one must make an especially meritorious contribution. Barack Obama presented Madeleine Albright with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012. She was so proud to receive this honor, and she kind of even boasted about it to Colin Powell. She couldn't resist asking, "Do you have one of these?" To which he replied, "No, Madeleine, I have two." Madeleine Albright died March 22nd of last year. At her funeral service, President Joe Biden said, "Freedom endures against all odds in the face of every aggressor, because there are always those who will fight for that freedom. And in the 20th and the 21st century, freedom had no greater champion than Madeleine Corbell Albright." And a final quote from this great citizen: "It's important, however, to have a guiding star. For me, that star has always been faith in the democratic promise that each person should be able to go as far as his or her talents will allow." Thank you for listening today. I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Red in the back.
Did she ever remarry, or was she ever involved in any long-term relationship after she divorced?
No, she didn't. She didn't cover that in either book. She had many friends, hundreds of friends, so many friends, and she was always surrounded with people. But to my knowledge, she never had another serious long-term relationship with anyone. And next to you?
Well, I was going to ask you to recommend one of the books. What would you think if I could only read one, which would be yours?
I have one question back to you that'll make it easier to answer. Are you an international policy nerd? This is the nerd book. This is the love hearing just interesting, fascinating stories. So Hell and Other Destinations would be the one for that person. Anyone else? Yes. Chris.
There was no other mention of her children.
Oh, and that's my fault. Her children were such an important part of her life. I believe Anne went on to be a judge. Everyone in the family was successful, very close, and so I'm sorry that I didn't spend more time talking about her children, but yes, they're a very important part of her life. Yes.
Madeleine Albright was the first person I ever heard use the phrase "America is an indispensable nation." Did she originate that?
To my knowledge, yes. I think it is, and it's a real important statement. Dan?
Does she comment in either book about her relationships with the presidents that she knew? Obviously, being in the upper echelon of government, she's come in contact. I'm particularly interested in what her comments may have been in the book, given her close relationship with Hillary, given what happened in 1997 and 98 with Bill. Does she comment on any of that?
She sure does. She had a very, very close relationship with Bill Clinton. She said there was something that really made him special. It was his ability to truly listen to people, even though that job is, chaos all the time. But she also treated the sex scandals, both of the sex scandals in this book, and how sorely disappointed in his character that she was about that. She didn't cover whether she had any close relationship with Jimmy Carter, but she certainly had some special relationships with some of the diplomatic personnel in other countries, famously her counterpart in Russia. That was a very interesting relationship, both competitive and yet there was a lot of camaraderie there. There was, back in those days, there was even a little bit of trust, if you can imagine. Other questions? Yes.
I was a little confused when you started talking about her Jewish roots.
Yes.
When you mentioned that family picture and then there was a comment. And I don't know if I just didn't hear it or didn't hear it right or exactly what, but you talked about people that were in her family that were in Auschwitz. Was she there too?
She was not. She had no knowledge. Her parents never told her of her Jewish heritage. They, during all of the time that she was growing up, they were practicing Catholics.
Right, I knew that, but I mean, in that picture,
Mhm.
she looks pretty young.
Yes.
And I just wondered whether or not, I mean, there were a lot of children that went to the camps, and especially if it was at the end of the war, did live.
Right. So she was only told that the people in the picture had died. She didn't know about how they died. Yes, she was in those pictures. They died. Of course, they died. She was in America, back in America, and in London. It was during the 6 years that she was in London that those family members were shipped to Auschwitz and died. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.